crowd. I'm Mike Ehrmeyer. I'm president of the Historical Society. For those of you who are new, we've been around literally since 2000. We do these programs once a month. You have a schedule on your chair of those programs. And we just finished some real successful walking tours. I want to introduce some folks who are here that are part of the leadership group of this organization. Helen Wilson, our vice president, over there. Evelyn Young is our treasurer back there. Jim Hammond is one of our board members. Toby Chapman is around. Audrey Glickman at the camera is here. And
Suggesting you
Wayne
use the
Bossinger
microphone.
is in the back, and Jean Greenstock is in the back. So we have a lot of our board members here. We're a volunteer group. We're a volunteer group. You can join us for a very nominal fee. We have put out 2 books which are for sale in the back. And shortly, we have a rather large now website, which I urge you to look at, squirrelhillhistory.org. Very soon, we're going to be on PayPal, and we'll be able to pay things through the PayPal system, which we've never been able to do before. So we hope you consider joining, but these meetings are always free, and we're very happy to have you here. I want to announce a couple things. We have a meeting in August, which is kind of special. First of all, it's on a Thursday night, because we don't usually meet in August, so it's on the 16th. We're going to help the Squirrel Hill Urban Coalition, which is the planning group for this neighborhood, celebrate their 45th birthday. So we're going to have refreshments, and they're going to talk. They've been here before. They're going to talk not just about their history, but some of the plans that they have for Squirrel Hill. And then we just have a nice party. And I want to make that a good party, so I hope many of you consider coming. That's Thursday night, the 16th. July 18th, coming right up, next week, our sister, brother, historical group, the Lawrenceville Historical Society,
What was that?
Spoken here,
What was the name
is
you
doing a lecture called The Mayor of Shantytown,
What's the
a
name of
journalist who has made
Lawrenceville?
himself sort
Oh,
of a
Lawrenceville.
specialist on crime and other issues in Squirrel Hill, in Pittsburgh. Unusual stories he's researched. I think he just did one on prohibition for the East Liberty Historical Society. In Lawrenceville, he's talking about the mayor of Shantytown, which is a Roman Catholic priest who worked, I think, in both the Strip and Lawrenceville. And 6:30, Carnegie Library on Fisk Street on Wednesday the 18th. So please consider going that. And we are hoping to have Rich come to see us next year to do a lecture that he hasn't done elsewhere, that he's working on crime in Pittsburgh with some vignettes of Squirrel Hill. It's not on the schedule yet, but we're working on it. So those are the events I'd like you to know about. You might see us, there's a Squirrel Hill happening on the 21st here in this community, and we're going to be putting a booth up, and anyone who can help out and come see us and join us, it's a lot of fun. Betty Connolly, our other vice president, just came in, so there's the other officer that's here tonight. Tonight's program is one that, to me, is one of the more original ones we put on. In other words, to put it another way, most of us sitting in this room know very, very little about Freemasonry. And the suggestion was made last year that we ought to remedy that. And so we have a Squirrel Hill resident, I think you are, aren't you? Downtown. But active up here, Austin Shifrin is going to speak to us about the history of, and whatever else he wants to, about Freemasonry. Austin has been involved in a number of different lodges in the Freemasons. I've just mentioned he was in Scottish Rite Valley of Pittsburgh in 2006. joined something called the Princes of Jerusalem in 2014, and joined the Shriners in 2014, and the East Hills Royal Arch Chapter in 2016. And all of those are terminology which I assume we'll know more about at the end than we do right now. So without further ado, thank you for coming. Join us. Austin, you need to hold this up fairly close to your mouth, okay?
Absolutely. I'm extremely flattered and humbled that so many folks came out this evening, so I just wanted to thank you all first for being here. I foolishly attempted to cram a tremendous amount of information into this presentation, and it kind of weaves back and forth in between being the personal, in terms of the travels that I've had so far, and the historical. If you folks would be kind enough to hold questions to the end, I would much appreciate it. And on Audrey's advice, I will attempt not to make up any of my responses. So my name is Austin Shifrin. I've already been introduced. I grew up in New York City in a conservative Jewish family, although not extremely observant. As a child, I spent a good amount of time with my mother's parents, and I had a great affinity for my grandfather. He was silly and fun, but also a very intellectual man. He devoted himself to the practice of chiropractic care in an era where it wasn't really an established medical science yet. He also had an interest in Eastern medicine, philosophy, and other esoteric subjects. At some point as a younger man, he had become involved with the Freemasons. When I was in high school, I became interested in some of the esoteric subjects that I first discovered in his library. And there eventually came a point where I asked him about the Freemasons. He said to me, well, you're about to go off to college. Freemasonry is a fraternity. Why don't you go see what the fraternal experience is like for yourself, and if it interests you, we can discuss it more. I know now that when he said that, he couldn't have had any idea how much Greek fraternities on college campuses had changed in the 60 or so years since he had been in college. So I came to Pittsburgh to attend Carnegie Mellon in 1993, and although I had fun delving into the college fraternity experience, I didn't see something of compelling value in it. So I didn't pursue membership in one of those, and I didn't discuss Freemasonry any further with my grandfather, something I have kicked myself for ever since. I didn't give it a lot of thought in the interim, but when I did suspect that there must have been some disconnect in his making that comparison, 13 years later, I had long since finished undergrad and graduate school and was living and working in the South Side of Pittsburgh. So anybody here familiar with South Side? All right, good, okay, just checking. Haven't put you to sleep yet. I had put down roots in Pittsburgh. I had many friends in the neighborhood, including some of the business owners along the main drag of Carson Street. So it piqued my curiosity when I was walking past the Carson Street Deli one day, and I saw a flyer. It was advertising a social gathering. Come out, watch the Pro Bowl, eat Hokies, and shoot some pool, and it was sponsored by several Masonic bodies. So I walked in and I asked the owner, Eric, about this flyer in his window. He told me he had been a member for some 5 years at that time, enjoyed it very much, was fairly active in it. So I shared with him the history of my inquiry to my grandfather, the experiences that followed, and my suspicion that the comparison he had drawn might not have supplied me with the best analogy. And I wanted to know more. So Eric said, well, why don't you come out to this event, see what you think of it, and what do you think about the guys, and if it interests you, we can certainly talk more. I went to this event not really knowing what to expect. Would they be like the Stonecutters from the Simpsons episode? But they turned out to be ordinary men from a wide variety of backgrounds and really pleasant and easy to talk to. I had a great time. Sometime shortly thereafter, I told Eric this was something I would be really happy to be a part of. And I asked him what sort of requirements there were. Asking him was itself the first step. And this is how I first became involved in June of 2006. In the 12 years since then, I became a member of a Masonic lodge, then an officer in that lodge. Then I led that lodge. I know what this volunteer organization stuff is like. I've since traveled to visit many others, as well as joining other branches of the Masons, which we refer to as appendant bodies. Tonight, what I'm going to do is share with you my experience in those travels and also use that as the basis to share with you the history of the organization. The factual history of Freemasonry that's available is often commingled with lore and anecdote. I've based anything that I'm delivering to you today on sources that I consider reputable, and I will be happy to furnish those sources. The most sound and plausible origin story I've encountered is this. We know that there existed a guild of stonemasons in England, and such a guild was an organization where a prospect might be apprenticed to learn a trade and become a skilled craftsman. Rather than resorting to legend, we can point to a specific manuscript to give us an understanding of how early such entities were organized. The oldest Masonic document in existence is a manuscript that was published in 1840 by a Mr. James Orchard Hallowell, and thus it is often referred to as the Hallowell manuscript. It's also known as the Regius Poem, and is in fact in verse. Now, it was published in 1840, but scholars date its authorship somewhere between 1390 and 1445. So without resorting to legend, I like to say at least we can safely date it back this far. What seems likely is that the guild, which was a fairly public entity, had within it a quasi-religious body, a fraternity. And while the practical guild, or what my cohort referred to as operatives, lost their raison d'etre over time, because people were not demanding building more stone buildings after a certain era, the fraternity was kept alive underground to survive the Reformation and re-emerge to intrigue the natural philosophers of the Renaissance era as what we would call symbolic or speculative masonry. And it's by that route that you find men like Elias Ashmole being initiated in 1646, men who had no interest in building actual stone edifices, but who wanted to learn the philosophy and symbolism that has been preserved and handed down. In 1717, 4 lodges in London met together with a few goals in mind: to create a joint central body from among their members, draft a constitution for this new entity, and organize regular gatherings, to declare some authority over the lodges in London, which at that time was some 3 square miles in area. And this is how the lodges that once met at the Goose and Gridiron Alehouse, the Crown Alehouse, the Apple Tree Tavern, and the Rummer and Grapes Tavern, yes, these are people who knew how to enjoy themselves, formed the premier Grand Lodge of England. It was the first such central authority in the world. All Masonry in the United States derives its pedigree from this United Grand Lodge of England. This is a quality that we refer to as regular, and a lodge that cannot trace its lineage back to this is irregular. Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey were the first recognized in the US. We have a Grand Lodge for each state. There is no national governing body, although in the contemporary era, the heads of these Grand Lodges will sometimes convene to share ideas and compare practices.
Mr. Shifrin, I just wanted to say, if you have a red Chevy Outback, your parking lights are on. That was the gardener next door. Just wanted to mention a red Chevy Outback. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Quite all right.
We don't want dead batteries. So.
Nobody likes that.
Sorry.
It's okay. The Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania was founded in 1731, formed from what was once St. John's Lodge, which met in Tun Tavern. Tun Tavern is also considered the birthplace of the Marine Corps. It's been held at a few different physical locations since then: the Free Quaker Meeting House at 5th and Arch Street, and the Pennsylvania State House, which we now know as Independence Hall, are the past locations that are still standing. Benjamin Franklin became a Mason when he reached the minimum age at that time of 25 years old in 1731. His ascent through the ranks was astounding, and he became Grand Master of Pennsylvania in 1734. While many are aware of his diplomatic work on behalf of the United States with the French, less commonly known are Franklin's Masonic ties in that country. He was in Paris in 1778 to help initiate the writer, historian, and philosopher Voltaire into Lodge Neuf Soir. I took 7 years of Spanish, I'm trying to pronounce things in French. A prominent lodge there that was significant in organizing aid for the American Revolution. Today, we have a beautiful Grand Lodge building at 1 North Broad Street in Philadelphia. It's a National Historic Landmark. The architect was James Hamilton Windrum, and it was designed in the Norman Romanesque style. It was begun in 1868 when over 10,000 people assembled for the laying of the cornerstone. It was completed and dedicated in 1873. It contains themed lodge rooms emulating the cultures of Egypt, Greece, Italy, Germany, Spain, and France, as well as a library and museum, and it is open to tours by the public. Currently, Pennsylvania Freemasons number over 95,000 members, with over 400 lodges in 66 counties. More specific to our region of the state, Lodge 45 is the oldest permanent lodge west of the Allegheny Mountains. This makes some sense on the surface of it, as the lodges are usually numbered in the order that they are warranted, which is to say, granted permission to form by a Grand Lodge. So Lodge 45, in an environment where many of them are triple digits, was clearly pretty early on. The wording for their claim is specific and careful because there's a long tradition of military lodges that are warranted within the military unit that composes them, and they're permitted to meet wherever they may be stationed. Some military lodges precede 45 in western Pennsylvania. Regimental Lodge number 19 was warranted by the Provincial Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania in May of 1779 and held meetings at Fort Dunmore, later to become known as Fort Pitt. The last known worshipful master, our term for the president of Regimental Lodge number 19, became a charter member of Lodge 45. There's anecdotal evidence that at one point in the 1790s, Lodge 45 was meeting in the Cross Keys Tavern on Wood Street near the corner of Diamond Alley, which is now Forbes Avenue. There's 5th. There's Diamond Alley. In 1809, while some members of Lodge 45 were splintering off to form another, the ones that were remaining behind were formulating a plan to erect their own building. They were deeded a perpetual lease by William McCullough and his wife Jeanette to a space at the northwest corner of Wood and 5th. A set of trustees executed the paperwork attesting that they would hold the property for the benefit of the lodge. 2 years later, the lodge had successfully built a building on the spot in time to hold a special procession into their new building on St. John the Baptist's Day, June 24th, 1811, in which they invited the members of Lodge 113 to join them. Lodge 113 met very nearby on the southeast corner of the Diamond, which we now refer to as Market Square. In August of 1815, the members of Lodge 113 began to explore the notion of sharing space with Lodge 45 instead. They ended up sharing the new space until 1818, when they became interested in again having a space of their own. After a false start elsewhere, they ended up in the upper floor of a warehouse belonging to one William B. Foster, one of their members. By the fall of 1822, Lodge 45 was now looking to move in with Lodge 113 instead, and discussing how to dispose of their building on 5th and Wood. They decided to sell it to a Mr. Benjamin Darlington, father of a member and past master of McCandless Lodge 390, who was also named Benjamin Darlington. Mr. Darlington proceeded to use the buildings as an addition to Darlington's Hotel, also at the corner of 5th and Wood. Herein lies another lovely little bit of history. When Masonic brother and beloved war hero General Lafayette came through Pittsburgh on his victory tour in 1825, he stayed in the room that was originally occupied by the lodge. According to a quote from one of Darlington's sons, "The room in which Lafayette slept at the Mansion House, to my boyish notions, was one of the most magnificent ever constructed. It had for many years been the lodge room of the Freemasons. The ceiling was arched, painted with figures of the sun, moon, and stars. When the Masonic lease expired, the decorations were allowed to remain." Misconception about lease versus sale notwithstanding, it's heartwarming to me to think of Lafayette spending the night in these arrangements. Today, there is a brass plaque on the very spot, which is now one PNC Tower downtown, which reads, "This building marks the site of the hotel where Lafayette lodged from May 30th to June 1st, 1825, on his tour as the nation's guest. The tavern was known as the Mansion House and was removed about 1838. Meanwhile, Lodge 45 apparently shared space with 113 and 165 for some time, along with 2 York Rite bodies. But in 1823, all of the lodges began collaborating on the idea of building their own entire building. At the time, it came to no fruition, nor did similar rumblings in 1826. Anybody in here who's ever tried to fundraise money for building an entire building gets it. In 1829, however, an opportunity arose when two furniture manufacturers, a Mr. McGill of Lodge 45 and a Mr. Darcy of Lodge 165, proposed to build a building for their business on the corner of Smithfield Street and 3rd Avenue, and to allow the Freemasons the use of the upstairs. They took up occupancy of that space sometime in the summer of 1830, and they were there until the Great Fire of Pittsburgh on April 10, 1845, in which the building and most contents were destroyed. But a mere 5 days later, they met at the office of Brother Samuel McKinley to discuss what to do, and were visited by a contingent from a different fraternal organization, the International Order of Oddfellows, who kindly invited them to make use of their space at the southeast corner of Wood Street and Virgin Alley, which is now known as Oliver Avenue. The Masons sent a small group to assess the suitability of such a proposal, and the invitation was accepted. But this was only ever viewed as a temporary fix, and with two new lodges constituted in 1846, a St. John's 219 and Franklin 221, the Masons shortly had their eye on building their own location yet again. In 1850, they built a temple on 5th Street downtown, later to be named 5th Avenue, on land purchased from a member and real estate dealer, George R. Riddle. The first floor housed some businesses, the second a venue for lectures and concerts, and the third reserved for Masonic activities. In April of 1851, P.T. Barnum brought the vocalist Jenny Lind, also known as the Swedish Nightingale, to Pittsburgh, with all the fanfare of today's pop stars. Further renovations to the building were needed, just to accommodate her performance. Some 7,000 or 8,000 people never even made it into the hall. The beloved venue remained the meeting place for several of Pittsburgh's Masonic bodies until the night of August 12, 1887, when this location too was destroyed by fire. Very little was able to be recovered. A few of the officers' insignias that hang from ribbon collars, which at the present day are in a display case at the Greater Pittsburgh Masonic Center, one Seth Thomas clock, and a partly wrecked officer's chair, from whose oak remains 3 canes were made and distributed to members. Thanks to the unusual cautiousness of their lodge master, a Harry D.W. English, their warrant had been kept in his office safe and was also preserved. This the lodge continues to keep in a customized container which appears at their meetings. The day immediately following the fire, one of the local Scottish Rite Masonic bodies, a term I'm going to explain at more length shortly, stepped in to convene a meeting of the current officers of the lodges who had lost their building to coordinate efforts to relocate, and many past officers attended as well. They cooperated to rent space in the Renshaw building at the corner of Liberty and 9th, which was sufficient to their purposes as a temporary arrangement. However, they were determined to rebuild at the very same location on 5th Street. Because Freemasonry draws its history and symbolism from architecture and construction, it has particular ceremonies which ought to accompany the laying of cornerstones. On September 11th of 1888, a new cornerstone was laid in a solemn ceremony, including officers from our Grand Lodge in Philadelphia, that began with a procession to the site consisting of some 1,450 Masons. By April of 1889, Masons were meeting at the downtown 5th Street site again. They remained at that site until 1915, when a new building was built in Oakland. That temple was built from 1914 to 1915, and the architect was Benno Jansen, who was also responsible for the William Penn Hotel and the Mellon Institute. In 1993, the University of Pittsburgh proposed to the trustees of the building a generous offer, which they considered it in the best interests of the organization to accept. The Masons were permitted to continue their use of the facilities while construction on a new location took place, on Cemetery Lane in Ross Township, which would be referred to as the Greater Pittsburgh Masonic Center. The Cornerstone Ritual there was conducted by the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania on October 9th of 1995, and the construction was concluded in the fall of '96. The former temple was designated a landmark by the Pittsburgh History and Landmarks Foundation in 2002, and is now University of Pittsburgh's Alumni Hall. Now, I imagine I could come off as a biased presenter of this subject matter, as a member of these organizations who would be disposed to present them in a positive light, but I do believe the study of history ought to remain as objective as possible, and it is in this spirit that I will share with you some information about darker episodes in the history of Freemasonry in the US and its specific significance for the Pennsylvania and Pittsburgh regions. It began in part with a man by the name of William Morgan, who was born in Culpeper County, Virginia in 1774. In his travels in upstate New York in the 1820s, he visited several lodges, claiming to be a member and was believed. In 1825, he had one of the York Rite, one of the appendant body degrees conferred upon him in Leroy, New York. Shortly following which, he signed a petition calling for the creation of a new chapter in the town of Batavia, New York, where he resided. However, some members in Batavia who were uncertain of his character and some of the veracity of his claims of membership chose to exclude him by crossing his name out on the petition. Stung by the insult, although his debts may also have contributed to commercial motivations, Morgan then struck a deal with a receptive printer, a David C. Miller, to publish an expose of Masonic secrets, something that is antithetical to Masonic principles. When word got out around Buffalo, Canandaigua, Leroy, Lewiston, Lockport, and Rochester, the area Masons were scandalized. They knew that divulging the secrets of the organization is strictly prohibited, and might have been further upset were they aware that such materials had already been published abroad and could be had in the US. In defense of the fraternity, they planned to thwart the publication. Their efforts began with harassment and threats, which proved ineffective. On September 10th of 1826, someone tried and failed to burn down Miller's print shop. In the days that followed, a warrant was issued for Morgan's arrest on charges of stealing a shirt and cravat from an innkeeper in May of that year. He was taken into custody, brought to Canandaigua, released for lack of evidence, and promptly rearrested for a rather small debt to another innkeeper. But that he admitted to, so he went back into incarceration. That night, in the absence of the jailer, 3 Masons convinced the jailer's wife to release Morgan upon payment of the debt. She subsequently witnessed Morgan being abducted by 4 unidentified men, and he was never heard from again. This incident, along with accusations of cronyism among Masons in government or other positions of authority, catalyzed a movement that led to the first viable third party in American politics, the Anti-Masonic Party. One very active figure in the Anti-Masonic Party was a Thaddeus Stevens, a teacher at an academy in York, Pennsylvania, who went on to practice law. He had a deep-seated mistrust of secret societies and placed a premium on egalitarianism and objectivity in the justice system. His career in the party kicked off in 1829 when he worked to coordinate efforts in Adams County, founded the Gettysburg Star, and was a booster for Joseph Ritner for governor. Ritner, from Berks County in eastern Pennsylvania, was the child of poor German immigrants. He had enough success as a wool weaver to secure horses and a wagon and move himself west to Washington County. He was elected to the House of Representatives in 1820 and was honored with the role of Speaker in 1824 and 25. Although it's uncertain what aligned him with the movement, it's possible it related to opposition to Jackson on an 1827 tariff bill that raised rates on wool. In his several campaigns for governor against George Wolfe, a Jacksonian Democrat and prominent Mason, Ritner was defeated in 1829 and 1832, eventually succeeding in 1835. One other success of the Anti-Masonic Party was personified by Harmer Denny, the son of Pittsburgh's mayor, who carried Allegheny, Armstrong, Beaver, and Butler counties to be elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1824. As an anti-Masonic candidate, he served 3 terms in Congress from 1829 to 1837. While the power of the Anti-Masonic Party began to decline after 1832, it was still considered a significant force in terms of its endorsement of a candidate, especially for the Whig nominees. Accordingly, in the 1836 presidential contest between Daniel Webster and William Henry Harrison, Webster was heavily courting the party. Having persuaded Webster to come out with a staunchly anti-Masonic statement, Denny gave him a pretty clear indication it would likely result in their endorsement. However, in spite of Denny's being selected presiding officer at the state nominating convention, the delegates splintered into factions, and the vote went to Harrison instead. By their next national convention in 1838, the party was perceived as having been more or less subsumed by the Whigs. While the presence of the anti-Masonic Party on the American political scene was relatively short-lived, I acknowledge as valid the concerns of a general public on the outside looking in, and what the perceptions of Masonic allegiance could be. And because I was aware of the Morgan affair before I joined, I wondered whether that episode had relevant implications for what I was contemplating getting involved in. But I was convinced my grandfather would never have enlisted in something unsavory, and I didn't have the impression that my friend Eric would either. From the beginning of my experience, I looked to Eric for guidance in how to proceed. A person could certainly focus time and energy to delve deeper into the experience of the main organization of Masonry, which we colloquially refer to as Blue Lodge. A nickname for which I have heard interesting anecdotal explanations, but I'm not convinced I've heard one definitive one. Eric, however, had chosen to diversify his pursuits among several of the appendant bodies. Those are organizations for which membership in Blue Lodge is a prerequisite. So I followed suit. He seemed especially pleased that my initiation in Blue Lodge concluded 1 month before a window to join the Scottish Rite, another group in which he was active. So, in November of 2006, I joined up. I'm the little guy in the back. One first important fact to recognize is that Scottish Rite Masonry is not Scottish in origin, it is French. In the 18th century, the French performed a few Masonic degrees beyond the 3 common to the standard system, that baseline that I will usually refer to as Craft Lodge or Blue Lodge Masonry. Although these higher degrees varied a bit in their content from place to place, there was one fairly universal one which bore the title of Écossais, French for Scottish, which later became the moniker for an entire set of higher degrees. In 1761, a fellow by the name of Etienne Morin was granted a document giving him a mandate to regulate any craft lodges under the French Grand Lodge throughout the world, including their holdings in the Western Hemisphere. As a trader who traveled, he was well suited for this role. It's believed that at some time, while having this document duplicated, he also embellished on it, attributing to himself authority over the higher degrees as well. He also composed documents to organize and govern these bodies, and in 1762 returned to San Domingo, which has since been renamed the Dominican Republic. There he deputized one Henry Franken. Franken helped Morin document the rituals and was steeped in the degrees. Subsequently, it was he who brought the content to America, which was not yet even its own nation. This was the source of the Ineffable Lodge of Perfection, a group opened in Albany, New York in October of 1767, offering degrees 4 through 25. But by late 1774, the Albany body had lost its momentum and closed up shop. There were a few other abortive starts like this, in Philadelphia from 1782 to 1789, and in Charleston, South Carolina from 1783 to 1796. On May 31st of 1801, a group of members convened in Charleston, dubbing themselves the Supreme Council 33rd Degree of Freemasonry, led by Colonel John Mitchell and Reverend Dr. Frederick Dalco, 2 veterans of the Revolutionary War. Among the others in attendance were Isaac Auld, a prominent physician and Dalco's associate, Comte de Grasse-Tilly, the son of a French admiral, Jean-Baptiste Marie de la Hogue, the Count's father-in-law, Thomas Bartholomew Bowen, a printer, Abraham Alexander, Emmanuel de la Mata, and Isaac de Costa, all Sephardic Jews, Israel de Lieben, also Jewish, who had emigrated to the US from Prague at the age of 21, Moses Clava Levy, a prosperous Polish merchant, and James Moultrie, also a physician. While this marked the beginning of a healthy, settled, and organized phase for Scottish Rite Masonry in the southern US, matters were in evident disarray in the north. 3 competing groups were claiming ultimate authority in New York. One headed up by a Joseph Surnow, who had received the degrees in Cuba, another led by Antoine Bedaud, who had become active in the higher degrees in the French West Indies, and yet another led by Abraham Jacobs, who had gotten his charter in Jamaica. The southern body sent de la Mata to investigate the situation and determine the legitimacy or validity of each of these and recommend what ought to be done. Having approached all 3 in 1813, de la Mata's findings can be summarized as follows. Cernow's group was entirely uncooperative with the investigation, and Jacob's organization lacked the appropriate establishing documents. Bedaude's group was found compliant and deemed the equal of the Charleston group for what would later become known as the Northern Masonic Jurisdiction of the United States of America. Daniel Tompkins, who had served as secretary of the group and was governor of New York at the time, became the first sovereign grand commander, and John James Joseph Gorgas was the first grand secretary. In 1911, the Southern jurisdiction broke ground on a new headquarters, the House of the Temple in Washington, D.C. That building's still there and can be visited. The architect on that project was John Russell Pope, and he emulated the tomb of Mausolus at Halicarnassus, one of the 7 wonders of the world, which Henry Hornbostel had also taken as his inspiration for Soldiers and Sailors Memorial in Pittsburgh in 1908. The construction was completed in 1915, and it contained the first public library in Washington, D.C. It also contains the remains of Masonic author and luminary Albert Pike. Where'd he go? Who was reinterred there in 1944 when his remains were moved from Oak Hill Cemetery in the Georgetown neighborhood. The Northern jurisdiction began in 1813 by holding meetings in various locations around New York. Their operations were significantly disrupted by a scandal in 1826, which led to the formation of the first third party in American politics, the Anti-Masonic Party. The negative public sentiment persisted until around 1844, and the activities of the Northern Supreme Council were maintained largely by the heroic efforts of Gorgas, the secretary mentioned earlier, in honor of which one of the Pittsburgh bodies is named after him. It's the same group that stepped in to shepherd the Pittsburgh lodges in the wake of the fire in 1887. Throughout the 1840s, they convened in various quarters provided by the Grand Lodge of New York, but in the summer of 1845 appear to have met in Boston. Meeting minutes from 1851 indicate that the headquarters were now officially moved to the Grand Lodge building in Boston, despite the fact that the secretary remained in New York. In 1927, the body relocated to the Statler building in Park Square in Boston, and having outgrown that by the 1960s, relocated to a beautiful property in Lexington, Massachusetts, where it resides to this day. While each Blue Lodge typically serves the city or town in which it's located, the Scottish Rite is organized in such a fashion that there is one body which draws its membership from many surrounding lodges within a larger radius. That body is dubbed a valley. The Valley of Pittsburgh was established in the 1840s and used to meet in the temple on 5th Avenue between Tennyson and Lytton in the Oakland neighborhood, which we discussed earlier was also the home of Lodge 45. Today they are both located in the Greater Pittsburgh Masonic Center off of Cemetery Lane up in Ross Township. Bless you. Now, as I said, my friend Eric pursued many of the different side routes that are available to a member who has completed his standard 3 degrees. I was curious enough about exploring these options that I wanted to follow in his footsteps to the extent I was able. However, my curiosity about what one could learn via these experiences, combined with a feeling of duty to serve and support the groups that I felt I derived so much from, led me to pursue leadership positions in both the Blue Lodge and the Scottish Rite. I was grateful that others showed some confidence in my ability to contribute something of value in these roles. While I was eager to continue my exploration of the other appendant bodies, I believed I wouldn't have adequate time and attention to do so until my obligations in the first 2 were completed. I led my Blue Lodge, Tyrian number 644, as its worshipful master, finishing my term in December of 2013. I led one of the 4 groups that collaborate to govern the Valley of Pittsburgh, known as the Princes of Jerusalem, as its sovereign prince, finishing my term in the summer of 2015. Now, the appendant bodies once had an arrangement where a member could pursue membership in the shrine only after he had completed the entire course of either Scottish Rite or York Rite. Although that requirement was abandoned in 2000, I was attracted by the idea of joining the group in the sequence that it had been done historically. So I joined the shrine in November of 2014. The shrine as an organization was created by Masons in New York City in 1870. Walter M. Fleming and William J. Florence were members of a lunch club called the Knickerbocker Cottage at 456 6th Avenue. Florence, a famous actor, had participated in a party game at a gathering hosted by an Arabian diplomat, the finale of which purported to initiate the guests into a satirical secret society. Florence and, oh, and there's their lunch spot, the Knickerbocker Club. Florence and Fleming had already discussed the notion of an organizational offshoot of Masonry to be less focused on philosophy, ethics, and symbolism, and more so on recreation and mirth. Fleming took Florence's notes regarding his party experience and crafted the ritual, seal, and Middle Eastern garb that they would use. They also enlisted a Charles T. McClenahan, a renowned lawyer and Masonic ritualist, and William Patterson, a prosperous local printer. These, along with 9 other men, were initiated on June 16, 1871. We also know that they met at New York's Masonic Hall at 114 East 13th Street on September 26, 1872, for the purpose of formally organizing themselves and electing officers. However, the new organization did not take off in leaps and bounds. 4 years later, there were still only 43 members, and all but 6 of them were from New York City. Oddly enough, the catalyst that took the shrine into high gear seems to have been the creation of a national governing body, backwards though that might sound. In June of 1876, 30 of the members met again at New York's Masonic Hall, this time initiating 25 new members. So you can picture they're practically doubling the size. At a subsequent meeting to conduct the business of the organization, Fleming motioned for the creation of a national governing body to be called the Imperial Grand Council. We do love our titles. Fleming, who had valiantly shouldered much of the burden up to this point, was elected the first Grand Potentate, potentate being the honorific for the president of an individual shrine location, and grand being the prefix that we usually attach for somebody leading a national body. Notably, Samuel Harper, who would at one point be potentate of Pittsburgh's Syria Shrine, was elected the first Grand Marshal. This was also the meeting at which the resolution requiring Shriners to also be members in good standing of either the York Rite or Scottish Rite was enacted. In 1877, 3 men from Pittsburgh received their shrine initiation at Mecca Temple in New York City: Alexander Rooke, William Ramsey, and Samuel Wainwright. On their return, they met with other members in the living room of one George Balmain to discuss pursuing a charter for their own shrine temple. On May 19th of 1877, their labors came to fruition, and the charter was granted. 10 days later, they were electing the officers who would govern Syria Temple, including Samuel Harper as our potentate, who served in that capacity until 1884. Meanwhile, on the national stage, in 1888, 12 new temples were chartered, and the Imperial Council, which had dropped Grand from its name 2 years hence, convened in Toronto, the first meeting outside of the US. Members from Pittsburgh continued to appear in the national governing body. Past potentate Thomas Hudson became Imperial potentate in 1893, and past potentate William Brown labored in the role of Imperial treasurer. By 1899, there were 78 temples. In 1906, membership in the Shriners surpassed 100,000 men. By 1922, it would exceed 511,000. For some time, Syria Temple of Pittsburgh conducted its functions in Library Hall. Subsequently, they had a base of operations for some time in Turner Hall on Forbes Street until 1902. They then built their first building of their own on Washington Street, where they operated until 1911, when they sold that building and used the proceeds to buy property in Shenley Farms. Although there was a sluggish phase in the life of Syria Shrine from 1910 to 1912, when a committee contacted the membership in 1913 with plans for a new building, it spurred the members into action, and they pledged sufficient funds to begin the construction. 2 Shriners, Harris Ewell and Charles Rieger, were brought on as the architects. The groundbreaking took place at a spot that we now consider 4223 Bigelow Boulevard on April 20th of 1915. Construction was finished the following year, and the building dedicated with a week-long extravaganza that began October 23rd, 1916. The Monday was devoted to the Shriners, Tuesday to all Masons, Wednesday to the general public, Thursday was set aside for a dedication ceremony, Friday a ball was held for members and their ladies, and Saturday was reserved for the children. Some 40,000 people are reported to have attended. The auditorium at the mosque seated approximately 3,500 people, and it became common as became common at many shrine facilities elsewhere. It was rented as a performance venue by musical acts when not in use by the membership. Many Pittsburghers can regale you with nostalgic reminiscences of fondly remembered concerts they attended at this venue. What they might not know is that the Syria Mosque was also considered the birthplace of network television, as it was there that Dumont Television Network, later to become KDKA TV, made their first broadcast over a network of cables connecting 13 cities on the evening of January 11th of 1949. No history of the shrine would be complete without mention of the Shriners' Hospitals for Children. When the Imperial body convened in Portland, Oregon in 1920, a resolution was passed to create what was then dubbed the Shriners' Hospital for Crippled Children system. The first hospital providing pediatric orthopedic care was opened in Shreveport, Louisiana in 1922. In 1962, the Shriners of North America earmarked $10 million to found 3 hospitals dedicated to treating pediatric burn victims. Meanwhile, in Pittsburgh, the Shriners were faced with a familiar problem in the 1980s, a building in decline. The Mosque in Oakland was put up for sale in June of 1989. It was razed in August of 1991. In October of 94, the new Shrine Center in Cheswick was born. A $10 million, 40,000 square foot facility. Set on 37 acres, the building is accompanied by a proportionate amount of parking, a tremendous covered pavilion, and a wonderful playground for children. The driveway to the building is flanked by twin sphinxes, which made the journey from the original building, as did the enormous chandeliers in the ballroom. By this point in my own history, I had developed an appetite and curiosity to explore the various branches of Freemasonry through the appendant bodies. Eric told me that many interesting avenues also began via the York Rite. The York Rite had earlier appeared to me as some kind of contrast or alternative that one had to choose between versus the Scottish Rite. However, as I continued to travel, it became clear that a fair number of people belonged to both. I had heard some intriguing snippets about individual degrees or aspects, which one may also uncover with determined Googling, but I really ought not to reveal. I came to the conclusion that I was interested in pursuing this route also. So on Saturday, October 3rd of 2015, I received my first 2 degrees in a Royal Arch chapter at the Penn Hills Masonic Center, and on the 17th of the same month, I made a road trip with the members to the Washington Masonic Memorial in Alexandria, Virginia, to receive the Royal Arch degree in a lodge room inside the building. York Rite Masonry, as it currently exists in the U.S., is essentially a result of a schism in the Grand Lodge of England. I hope you'll recall my earlier description of the origins of the premier Grand Lodge of England, which was a collaboration of 4 lodges in London in 1717. To try to keep a long story slightly shorter, in 1751, a splinter group called into question the effectiveness of that body in faithfully maintaining the traditions. Accordingly, they spun off, calling themselves the Ancients, as in preserving ancient ways, and referring derogatively to the group that they left behind as the Moderns, as in introducing modern innovations. Sadly, an acrimonious division persisted until reconciliation was finally achieved in 1813, which is why the resulting body, which has subsisted to this day, renamed itself the United Grand Lodge of England. The term York Rite, until this point, had referred to the manner in which ordinary Blue Lodge initiation was conducted. However, in the process of settling upon what would be included from that day forward, some very well-loved material was now delegated to new and separate bodies. In the US, those bodies and degrees would come to be referred to as the York Rite, although considered to be transformed from its European origins and a product of American enthusiasm for higher degrees. In our system, the York Rite consists of 3 bodies: a chapter of Royal Archmasons, a council of Cryptic Masons, and a commandery of Knights Templar, commonly abbreviated as chapter, council, and commandery. There are chapters and councils in quite a few cities and towns operating with similar logistics to an individual lodge. Commanderies are slightly more dispersed depending on the other 2 bodies for membership, as they are prerequisites. York Rite has deep roots in Pennsylvania. With regards to chapter, the ancient Grand Lodge of England issued a warrant for Lodge number 3 in Philadelphia in 1758. Their minutes in 1767 make reference to possessing the necessary costumes and props for conferring the Royal Arch degree, and refer to it as such. When they finally adopted bylaws in 1789, they also named officers appropriate to conducting that work. There was some disruption in 1795 when a fraudulent member, James Molan, turned up on the scene and proceeded to create new chapters, even a grand chapter for the state. At this point, the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania stepped in, suspended the impostor's activities, and created a proper grand chapter for Pennsylvania under the authority of the Grand Lodge of the same. With regards to council, a Grand Council for Pennsylvania was created by 2 councils here, and with the aid of one from Texas in 1847. Some of their meeting minutes from subsequent years have been uncovered. In 1854, a peculiar suggestion was floated to surrender the authority for the cryptic degrees to one of the Scottish Rite bodies, the Princes of Jerusalem. This did not succeed, and the Grand Body was reorganized in December of that year. Both Chapter and Council for Pennsylvania have maintained independence from general Grand Bodies of their respective organizations. Those are metagroups where the Grand Bodies of multiple states confer together. With regards to commandery, Pennsylvania can lay claim to having created the first Grand Encampment of Knights Templar on May 12th of 1797, also, unsurprisingly, in Philadelphia. At the time, it had 4 subordinates which answered to its authority: numbers 1 and 2 in Philadelphia, number 3 in Harrisburg, and number 4 in Carlisle. The 2 Philadelphia commanderies merged under number 1 in 1812, and with the collaboration of a new number 2 in Pittsburgh, created a new Grand Encampment in February of 1814. This lasted 10 years, at which time, owing to anti-Masonic sentiment in the country, which I elaborated on, the Templars in Pennsylvania had been winnowed down to St. John's Encampment number 4 in Philadelphia, which was simply operating under the Grand Lodge. As the Rite revived in 1852, St. John's was able to band together with Philadelphia number 5, Union number 6, and De Malay, a youth group based in Reading. However, the Grand Lodge deemed it inappropriate that they should wield authority over the Templar degrees, and in 1857 a new Grand Encampment was formed. Unlike Chapter and Council, the Grand Encampment of Pennsylvania is affiliated with a national body. Now, as it happens, I can go into quite a bit of detail regarding the history of my specific Royal Arch chapter, as they saw fit on their 100th anniversary in 1988 to publish a book on the subject. And because it was in reality created by the merger of 3 different chapters, this history actually offers a broader survey than one might initially suspect, covering 3 different Pittsburgh neighborhoods, and touches on interesting shared topics and events with other branches along the way. It all began in January of 1888, when the secretaries of 2 lodges, a William Deal from Haleman Lodge 321 and Archie Henderson of Duquesne Lodge 546, circulated a letter to the attention of current Royal Arch Masons, inviting them to a planning meeting for a new chapter to meet in East Liberty. It is fair to infer this was a more prominent and bustling time for Freemasonry in general, when there was enough membership that people were creating new units. A meeting was held on February 6, and officers chosen to head up the new chapter. From several alternatives, it was decided to simply name the chapter Pittsburgh. The necessary permission from the Grand Body was secured, and the officers of Grand Chapter arrived themselves on April 30th to perform the fitting ceremonies to create Pittsburgh Royal Arch Chapter number 268. In Homewood, in the second half of 1912, 8 members gathered signatures from 46 fellow Royal Arch members on a petition to submit to the Grand Chapter of Pennsylvania to create a chapter in Homewood. 2 existing chapters, Zerubbabel number 162 and Pittsburgh Chapter 268, donated $200 apiece, a hefty sum in that era, to support their cause. So it was that on October 28, 1913, Homewood Royal Arch Chapter number 297 was constituted at the Homewood Masonic Hall at 7226 Kelly Street. 38 charter members, 22 visitors, and various officials and dignitaries were in attendance. Homewood initiated 60 candidates by the end of 1914. 2 years later, their membership was 167. 2 years later still, they numbered 213. By the end of 1920, they had 290 members. That's a compound annual growth rate of 34% a year. I was investing, I'd go for it. Meanwhile, in Braddock, several members of Braddock's Field Lodge, number 510, were desirous of creating their own Royal Arch chapter as well. Although their lodge building was not yet suitably outfitted for the ritual work, they were able to make the necessary renovations. They also felt they had the appropriate personnel at hand, having some existing chapter members, as well as regular lodge officers who at least had experience with memorizing dialogue. 7 main instigators of the action met to discuss planning, and 5 of them agreed to take on some of the main roles in administering the new body. Accordingly, on June 26th of 1917, members of the Grand Chapter traveled to 428-430 Library Street in Braddock for the purpose of constituting Braddock's Field Royal Arch Chapter number 303. Several notes that I found in the history of each chapter undoubtedly applied to all three in the way that these groups are governed and conduct themselves. For instance, in 1889, Pittsburgh chapter gets a letter jointly signed by Grand Lodge and Grand Chapter to shun the illegitimate Masonic bodies under that character Surno we were discussing during the Scottish Rite. They also made a donation to the chapter in Johnstown for flood relief. There was an order in 1915 that singing the Star-Spangled Banner would become part of the standard opening of meetings. And there was a time in October of 1918 when the bodies complied with an order from the State Board of Health not to meet in order to impede the spread of Spanish flu. There are some notes in the histories of these chapters that are more unique and distinctive. I took particular note of the fact that in 1938, clearly a lull in the quantity of new members inducted, Homewood chapter number 297 brought in only 5 members. 4 of them were initiated in a specially organized class and given their 3 Royal Arch degrees in one day, on March 10th. One noteworthy aspect was that one of Homewood's own past presiding officers, who had ascended to an office in the Grand Line, James Weir, was there to confer one of the degrees. Another noteworthy aspect was that one of the candidates that day was Cornelius Scully, then the mayor of the city of Pittsburgh. The context of that event points to one factor that all 3 chapters were certainly subject to, the ebb and flow of membership. All 3 experienced significant growth after World War I, then the impact on members' ability to keep up with dues during the Great Depression, and the impact on the organization, with many men leaving to fight during World War II. Over time, all 3 chapters were confronting the challenge of how to keep themselves vital. In August of 1946, the trustees of Pittsburgh Royal Arch Chapter met to plan selling and leaving their property in East Liberty and move into the temple on 5th Avenue in Oakland. In April of 1963, Homewood Chapter moved from their location on Kelly Street to the Wilkinsburg Masonic Temple at 747 South Avenue. But they later came to the conclusion this only led to further decline in interest, which we get to read with the benefit of 20/20 hindsight. This therefore led to their later move to the East Hills Masonic Temple at 5793 Salzburg Road, decided in May and executed in August of 1965. So it goes that on September 9th of 1974, a motion was introduced in a meeting of Pittsburgh Chapter 268 by member and past presiding officer Raymond Wirt that they merge with the other 2 chapters under the new name East Hills, meeting at the East Hills Masonic Temple on Salzburg, and retaining the oldest number of the 3, number 268. While East Hills Royal Arch Chapter today may not presently match the membership numbers of the heyday of the chapters that combined to form it, at 172 members as of June of this year, we do our best to honor our forebears by presenting ritual faithfully and enjoying the warmth of our fellowship. Given the trends that we've been discussing here regarding membership levels in the branches of Freemasonry, as groups decline and merge or cease operations, you can imagine it's somewhat uncommon to see the creation of a brand new unit. So when Eric approached me in late 2015 to discuss creating a chapter of Allied Masonic degrees, I knew that what he was sharing represented an unusual opportunity, generally speaking. But what specifically was the purpose of this organization, and was there enough to it to justify me joining something else? The Allied Masonic degrees grew out of a study group of Masons in Monroe, North Carolina, who met up throughout the late 1920s and early 1930s, often at the home of Brother J. Raymond Shute II. In 1930, he began communications with the secretary of one of the York Rite Grand Bodies in Scotland, George A. Howell, regarding one of the degrees that's performed in Scotland but not yet in the US. Permission was granted by the Earl of Cassils to confer the degree at the Grand Body in Asheville, North Carolina, on May 12th of 1931, where about 200 Royal Arch Masons received the degree of Excellent Master. The warm response of American Masons to this activity led to further conjecture about how to make this degree permanently available stateside, and import others from Scotland, without infringing on York Rite activities as already organized here. With a great deal of communication back and forth to solicit clearance from the proper Masonic authorities in North Carolina and in Scotland, Howell consented to grant the request of 3 units in the United States on the condition that they would foster their own Grand Body at their earliest convenience. Charters were granted at the annual meeting of the Supreme Grand Royal Arch Chapter of Scotland on March 21st of 1932, for the creation of the first 3 chapters in the U.S., St. Andrews in America 1A, St. Andrews in Monroe, North Carolina, Casillas number 2A in Raleigh, North Carolina, and Howell number 3A in Charlotte, North Carolina. True to the arrangement, on April 16th of the same year, they convened in Salisbury, North Carolina, to create the Grand Council of Allied Masonic Degrees of the U.S. At the Salisbury meeting, it was also agreed to hold another gathering in Washington, D.C. in May during a celebration of George Washington's bicentennial. 5 new councils were created by the time the D.C. meeting took place, so the Grand Council had their first official annual meeting a year later, May 8th of 1933 in Charlotte, where there was much business to conduct. They chartered 3 more councils, organized a newsletter for the publishing of research papers, created an honorary rank to bestow on the 21 founding members, and adopted the Constitution and bylaws that was proposed at the gathering in D.C. Not long after the meeting in Charlotte, however, it came to light that some of the degrees this Grand Council of Allied Masonic Degrees was offering had formerly been performed in the U.S. by a group in Norway, Maine, called the Sovereign Grand College of Allied and Christian Degrees. It was founded by an Episcopal rector and Masonic leader by the name of Hartley Carmichael, along with Josiah Drummond and Charles Nesbitt in Richmond, Virginia in 1882. The materials and proceedings of the organization had moved to Maine when Carmichael and Nesbitt passed away, and it was on its last legs. But its predating this Grand Council called their authority over these degrees somewhat into question. In July of '33, Shute and a companion, William Moseley Brown, traveled to Norway, Maine, and drew up an agreement to fold the Allied and Christian degrees into their Grand Council. This was formally adopted July 22nd, 1933, at a special session in Raleigh, North Carolina, giving them clear right to the duplicated degrees and adding new ones to the roster as well. So it would be worth pointing out here that in the time since I've joined the Masons, ritual has been a significant focus for me. In some groups, this amounts to memorized lectures, a somewhat solitary activity. In others, the ritual is presented in a theatrical fashion and involves rehearsals and more interaction with other members. In either case, it's something that I enjoy, so when the focus of Allied Masonic degrees on even more obscure ritual was explained to me, I was intrigued, and the opportunity to be a founding member certainly heightened the appeal. It was with those interests in mind that I showed up at a planning meeting at the Masonic Temple in Washington, PA on January 9th of 2016 to discuss with 10 other men the details and logistics for forming our own council of AMD. I had the meeting notes open in front of me while I was writing this presentation. We discussed existing councils in the Mon Valley, Turtle Creek, Butler, Claysville, how we intended to differentiate ourselves, how to get in touch with the governing authority to request permission, what our beginning slate of officers would be, and where and when we would meet, for which we settled upon the Masonic Hall in Uniontown. There was an interval of delay as some of our communication required an in-person follow-up at an annual gathering out of state, but on March 26th of 2017, we assembled in Uniontown accompanied by our guest Erastus Allen, the Grand Superintendent for Western PA. That's the fellow on the left with the glasses. As a representative from the Grand Body who delivered our document declaring us official, he performed the accompanying ceremony and installed our officers in their stations. Since then, we've held 2 other meetings and 1 dinner, initiated 2 brand new members, accepted 1 for dual membership, which means affiliating with our council while maintaining his membership in another, and we've received very positive feedback on our efforts from guests who visited us from other chapters. I serve this group as their secretary. It's been a pleasure banding together with people that I've known for a decade to embark on the journey of creating something new. Writing about it for this presentation made me feel a little bit like stepping into history. In several of these bodies that I've joined over the past 12 years, I'm happy to see the same faces in multiple settings, as well as some fellows who only belong to one or the other. Each group does a tremendous amount to support one form or another of philanthropy. Some focus more on conduct and philosophy. Others focus more on fellowship and entertainment. Most of them a nurturing balance of the two. All of them have a rich and colorful history, which it's been my great pleasure to share with you this evening. And I hope the presentation has satisfied some curiosity for you, although if it stimulated you to seek even further, all the better. Thank you very much for your time.
Let's take some questions.
Absolutely. Yes.
Are there women?
There are separate organizations, in the United States there are separate organizations that are either co-ed or exclusive to women. There's an organization called the Eastern Star, which includes both Masons and ladies. There are also Amaranth, and, oh, I'm thinking of one other and I'm blanking on it. So there are two other separate organizations that are for women only. What you find is that there are other regions of the world that have what we refer to as co-masonry, which means ordinary Blue Lodge masonry, including both men and women. Particularly, I know that they've got that in France. Yes?
So you use the terminology of temple, mosque, and lodge.
Yep.
What's the difference?
Okay. A lodge is a funny word that's multi-purpose. It's kind of like, did you ever watch that television show, The Smurfs? Remember how they use the word Smurf for everything? A lodge designates both the building where Masons meet, the unit of their group, kind of like a Boy Scout troop, and also the session of time that they're meeting in. So it's grammatically correct to say the lodge held lodge at the lodge. But ordinarily, a lodge is the term for the unit or building where a group of Blue Lodge Masons are meeting, the craft masonry, so the original 3 degrees. A temple typically refers to a slightly larger building that may be shared by multiple lodges. It used to be that all of the meeting places for the Shriners, and remember that membership in the Masons is prerequisite for membership in the Shrine. The meeting places of the Shriners were usually referred to as mosques, and now they're just referring to them as temples in an effort to be less controversial and to try to engender less confusion among the general public, not that that's necessarily done the job. I hope that helped. Yes?
Does each lodge have their own mission statement, or is there an overall mission statement?
There's more of an overall mission statement. That's a very good question. There's a certain amount of emphasis on unanimity and conformity. For people who find that unpleasant and uncomfortable, it would probably not be an enjoyable organizational experience. But there is something about aligning yourself to a large group of people to try to serve a higher purpose that some people find very fulfilling. And the stated motto, it's almost an old chestnut, is making good men better. Although, in reality, I'd say my interpretation of it is more that the organization meets us halfway. If you are striving for self-improvement, the organization really creates a fertile context where it's very possible. The philanthropy also, however, is a big focus for many people. Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania has a big focus on a program they've got called Change for the Troops or Help for Our Heroes, where we're gathering up spare change or paper money as people are willing to pitch it in their own lodges to purchase phone cards for deployed troops. So just something free we can hand to them and say, here, thank you. Yes?
The Shriners are visible in their hospitals, some circuses, parades.
Yep.
I'm sure there are other things. The non-Shriner part of Masonry looks more internal. That may be unfair, and that's why the question is, you just started to mention one philanthropy. Is there a lot of outward looking in all of Masonry?
Oh, goodness, yes. There's another group called the Grotto, and they focus on providing free dental work for children. There's the Scottish Rite Masons have a tutoring program for dyslexic children. There is a large amount of charity, both focused on members helping members who may have fallen on hard times, as well as trying to help folks outside the organization. If anything, your question about a mission statement was a really sound one, because sometimes it's almost as though the goals and aims of the organization are very diffuse, and it can be more confusing for people. There's an expression of trying to throw your arms around the world. Just want to help everybody. Yes?
Are there any religious requirements or prohibitions?
Yes. One of the very few requirements for membership is you have to believe in a supreme being, and only one. See how easy that was? Some people find that very restrictive. Some people find that fairly broad. I guess that your reaction to that could be pretty subjective. But one of the things that I very much enjoyed and appreciated about the organization is being able to commune in harmony with people of different cultural backgrounds than my own, but where we focus on our common ground. I like that a lot. Yes?
You mentioned, you start at the beginning, and then you gain degrees up to a certain point. Without giving away any secrets, could you say in a generic way, how do you advance from one stage to the next?
Okay, yeah. Well, in the Blue Lodge, the degree work is based on stories drawn from, chiefly from the Old Testament. There are 3 degrees, and the mechanics of it are fairly simple. First, one is supposed to approach the lodge and request membership. One is investigated. If you are invited then to join, you arrive on an evening, and you witness a ceremony and ritual about which you know nothing. It's a very exciting experience. And you are then expected, in order to earn your next degree, to go away for a month and learn a bunch of stuff. You are supposed to receive assistance from the people who vouched for your character and credibility to join in the first place, but ideally other people should also be qualified to assist you, and you then return, demonstrate your proficiency, and then you will receive your next degree.
What is the top degree, 33rd, is that?
Well, you ask a sound question. There's 2 different answers to that. We are urged not to think of them too strictly as higher, because there's also supposed to be a sense of equality, that we are all fellow workers operating together on the level. As far as I know, numerically, the 33rd is the highest in the Scottish Rite. And one of the reasons for it really is that you request the degrees leading up to that. You cannot request your 33rd. You are tapped and invited by the people who currently already possess that distinction. There are also branches outside the Scottish Rite in which the 33rd is not recognized because it's not part of their branch of the organization. But we all still generally respect and appreciate each other. Did that answer the question? Okay. Yes?
You said that, I think it was the homestead, that their building had to be remodeled in order to be able to do some of the ceremonies.
No. It wasn't, oh, I'm sorry, yes. Okay, I was jumbling up 2 stories. Go right ahead.
Are the ceremonies in all the different kinds of Masons the same?
Nope. And I suppose the amount that I can divulge without giving away too much is that there are some that are formalized and seem more like a recital. It's a person standing up with a lecture that they are delivering to you, and the person receiving their degrees is a passive audience. There are some that are a little bit more immersive. That's probably about as much as I can say. Yes?
What do you think of the one-day degrees?
Uh-oh,
Yeah.
We've got an informed questioner. I have mixed feelings about it. I feel like it's an awful lot of information to get thrown at a fella all at once. That said, I know that among the different motivations for introducing an innovation like that is the idea that nowadays you have fellas whose lifestyle and pace are just different. If you have a fella working evenings and he can't make it out to someplace, one night a month, 3 months in a row, and that's something else that accommodates him, or if he travels a lot for work, but he knows that one weekend he can go do that, I know that they're trying to serve the population. I do feel like each of these degrees packs so much information into it, it's an awful lot for a fellow to try to digest all at one sitting. Personal opinion.
What do you think was the reason that the George Washingtons and others of the world were attracted to Masonry?
I think it's because there's an emphasis on 2 tenets, at least, that I can think of. One is the accountability and the ethics, and the other is the loyalty to each other. Surely, with the things that he was going through, and the things that he needed out of the people around him, those would be very attractive. Yes?
I had started to ask you this earlier, but somebody asked me today when I mentioned Masons, and they said that in the early 1900s there was Jewish people couldn't join the Masons, and you said no, but was there prejudice, like Muslims and Jews?
Hey, look, the fact of the matter is that because it's an organization composed of human beings, even within this organization that holds itself to a pretty high standard, some of the biases and prejudices of the general public are reflected in the makeup of this organization. And just as society has come a long way since then, this organization has come a long way since then. To my knowledge, there was never a prohibition in the Blue Lodge against any monotheistic religion, but there was kind of a birds of a feather attitude. So you did have some predominantly Jewish lodges. I have many Jewish Masonic friends. I have many Protestant Masonic friends. I have a handful of Catholic Masonic friends. And I have seen 2 Muslim initiates into Freemasonry, which I thought was super cool in terms of representing, like the fact that there ought to be diversity in our country, in my opinion. That made me feel good. I really hope I didn't just shut everybody down. Yes?
Okay. So, what happened during slavery in the southern lodges?
You ask really good questions. One of the things that I didn't get to touch on in the presentation, partly because it wasn't part of my direct personal experience, and I was kind of weaving the personal narrative through the whole thing, even from the 18th century, in the US, there has actually been an entirely separate strain of black Freemasonry in the US. Today, there is mutual recognition between the two, and it is impossible to say how much closer that relationship could get over time. Also, when you consider the pressures of membership levels and so on and so forth, will people eventually learn to get along with each other? But there's a whole separate strain called Prince Hall Freemasonry. So if you ever want to look it up, it's Prince Hall. But I could talk more about that afterwards if you like.
But in terms of integrated lodges?
You have them now. You have them now. You probably didn't have a lot of them back then.
A couple more, please. Well, I think we're done.
I think I'm getting the hook.
This is about one of the newest worlds we've traveled in these lectures, my goodness. Thanks for coming. Please remember our meeting in August. Please consider joining or buying our books. And we have a tradition. Would you help take chairs over to that corner where we'll get them back together? And if you see any of the program literature about our meetings, could you drop it off at the table there? We need to reuse that. Thank you very much. Hope to see you in August.